Right, let's get going. Hello, good morning. I'm Todd, I'm from England, so it's good to be here. It's my third time in Poland, so once was freezing cold, the other was really hot, now we're in the middle, so it's a good time to be here. More like the English weather back home. So my talk today, it's quite packed full of information. So it's on component architecture and whether or not you do Angular 1, Angular 2, or you do not even do Angular, but you want to kind of understand this component architecture approach. This talk is kind of about that. And then at the end, we then apply some of those practices to Angular 2. So if you want to, or if you're on Twitter, you can ping me here. Any questions as well? I'll post the slides, a link to them as well. As you can see by my t-shirt, I work at a company called Telerik. Has anyone heard of Telerik? Quite a lot of people. Wow, awesome. So I've been there for about 6-7 months now as a developer advocate. So we do a lot of Angular 2 stuff, Angular 1 as well. If you are using Angular, who is using Angular at the moment? Oh, wow. Every time I expect no one, and then half the audience. So has anybody heard of ng-migrate? 1, 2, someone's itching. Okay, so ng-migrate is a project that I launched a few months ago. It's a migration guide from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So if you want to, check that out. Today we're going to be talking component architecture, types of components. We talk about stateless, stateful, smart, dumb components, all these different types of components. So we'll try and understand some of these. How we can then hook into like Oneway dataflow and how we can then apply them to Angular 2. So for those who've never heard of Angular or Angular 2, it's a JavaScript framework. Angular 2 went live last week or the week before, the first stable version, 2.0. It's a successor to Angular 1. And it's a lot bigger, it's a lot more powerful, it's completely scalable, it's incredible framework. And you can do a lot of things with it. So, we're gonna sort of do a little journey on, because I think when I used to build web applications, you sort of say, your boss says, oh, we need to build this upload file component, and you sort of just start typing code, and you don't really think about the data flow and these kind of things. So from a high level, we're going to try and picture, like if you imagine this is your Google Mail, Gmail inbox. So at the top, you can search for messages. On the left, you've got a list where you've got inbox, drafts, all these things. And in the middle, you've got the view container. So when you click on a message, that middle portion changes. You can click settings, and again, that middle portion changes. We also have the chat, which I put on the right, which is your Google Hangouts, where you can talk to people. So for this talk, we're going to be concentrating on the chat implementation. So inside of here, you might have 3 different components. You might have a profile component, where you've got your picture. You've got your chat list, where all of your friends that you've added, you can click on one of them and start talking to them. And you might also have a search box, so you can start searching for a friend and start typing, and it will filter the list down, for example. So the easy part is component architecture is everything as a component. So we have a root component, for example, and I've put child component, child component, child component. So everything kind of sits inside, and each of these different components are a different type of component. So one might be a stateful, one might be stateless. So we're going to learn about this as well. Now, is anybody using like React or something like this? Yeah, so when you use React, you use something like JSX. You can create your custom components. Angular uses like HTML, so you can create like the HTML5 web components, create custom elements. So the way that we would kind of design this, we would create some custom elements and say, okay, the chat profile, it's going to handle this. Chat list, it's going to render my friends. Chat search is going to be that input that we talked about. So you end up looking like a component tree like this. So the bottom 3 are then child elements or child components of the chat component. So before we even want to start doing some coding, we need to think about the types of these components. Has anybody heard of stateless and stateful components? A few people, nods. Everyone's tired still, more coffee. So a stateless component and a stateful component. In Angular, we also have this thing called a rooted component, where I'll mention it afterwards. But what we'll look at a typical stateless component. We'll start with stateful, actually, and then go backwards. So if you imagine our sidebar where we've got our chat, we need to obviously get some data. Now, we don't want our 4 different components to be making different requests and managing their own data. So what we do is create something called a stateful component, and they look the same as stateless, but they handle things a little bit differently. So in Angular 1, Angular 2, we have something called a service. So this is where we would abstract the business logic, we would put it into a different function, and inside of there we would make like an HTTP request, we would bring back the data, and then pass it down to further components. So inside of here, we might have our chat component. It goes and fetches all the chat data, our profile, whether we're online, offline, and maybe pre-populate the search box. When it's got that data, this is when we then go stateless. So when we've got that data, we then render into a stateless component. So if I've got a list of friends, I want a component to manage my list of friends. So what I do is pass a piece of data, like an array, down into that friend list. It will then render them all out. Now, I put here, we have defined inputs and outputs, and this is exactly the same in something like React as well. So we have an input, which is typically the data, and we have an output, which is typically an event or a function callback, which passes some new piece of data back in. So if you imagine, we have a chat component, which receives our initial data, and it hands it down to a stateless component, and we decide to click on a particular user, we can, instead of sort of clicking on the user, and in that component we start doing AJAX requests and things get messy, what we do is fire an event back to the parent and say, this component's telling you to go and do something with this user, where it could be open a text box and start typing. So this is just a high-level kind of overview. So this will make more sense as we keep going. So we have one-way data flow, which Angular 2 kind of stole from React. There were some good amazing design decisions in React. Angular 2 is a huge framework, and components are just one very, very small piece of it. It would take me about 3 years, I think, to explain the entirety of Angular 2 up here. So what works nicely with stateful and stateless components is this idea of one-way data flow. So we pass data down, and we have an event that goes back up. Now, if you're using React, for example, we have Redux. In Angular 1, we have ng-redux, so we can have a Redux binding for Angular 1. With Angular 2, it's heavily reliant on RxJS and observables. So in this case, we have something called ngrx store, which is kind of a Redux for Angular 2. So how does this work? If you imagine the green box is a piece of data, so it's a JavaScript function. It says, go and get me some data. It brings it back to our component. Now, the way that we pass this down into child components is something called property binding. So we just bind to a custom property. With React, it's like this.props.something, .foo.bar. So with Angular, we actually specify these property names, and we can bind to them. Similarly, we can do the exact same thing, and we pass the data down. Now, Angular has something called zones built in, which is an incredible change detection mechanism. That would be a huge talk on its own. But essentially, Angular is very intelligent and very quick detecting changes in Angular 2. So the way that once the data has come down, what we can do to get it back up is just pass up an event. Now, if you've used Angular 1 or another sort of MVC framework, you end up sort of creating these two-way bindings rather than one-way, which means that if something updates here that relies on something here, you get all these different crossovers and things get very difficult to manage. So with one-way data flow, it makes things much more simple, much more debuggable and predictable. So the data flows down, and when something changes, like a click event, we can then basically just tell the parent via a callback that something's changed. So onto the Angular 2 piece. So what we basically, has anybody seen this thing before? This framework presentation thing? It's pretty cool. So what we essentially need to get started with is a root component. So I think typically we used to have sort of these pages and templates and huge files full of information and bindings and stuff like this. But now we kind of think about the entire application as a component tree. So you have one component, you might have 2 components and 3 components and 3 components and 4 components, and everything is this big tree. So when we create a root component in Angular 2, we would import the component, which is a decorator in TypeScript. And we essentially create an annotation. So we do @component, and we pass in a piece of metadata to the particular ES6 class, like this. So we have an ES6 class, and we just say, this is going to be, this is very similar to React and JSX, but the template is above, it's not in the functions. So if we want to create an element called app, we've got this selector property, which we say the selector is app, and here's my template. I've then got this message property here. So we got this message property here, which then corresponds to anything inside the ES6 class. So that's just a very simple example. We've also got the onInit here. So other frameworks are starting to realize that these components are a great way to manage our application state. And we have these things called lifecycle hooks. So when data changes, when the component is ready, when the component is destroyed, we have all these different hooks. So you can see here, this one implements the onInit. So we're saying, I want to run a function, the lifecycle hook when the component is being initialized. So from here, this is just an empty root component. We don't need any data inside of here. So from here, if we were actually going to create these chat components and the chat profile, the chat list, and the search, we can imagine that we've created this file already. We've created the chat component. And what we want to do is essentially just use it in the template. Like, it's as simple as that. So we can import the component. We can use it as custom HTML. And then what we need to do to essentially render components inside of that component. So like we saw the component tree earlier, we had the chat at the top, and then we had 3 child components. So we're going to look at how to do a stateful and then stateless. Hopefully this will make sense. We should have time for some questions, or you can catch me outside. So we had our 3 components, the chat profile, chat search, and the chat list. So we're going to import all of these. And again, now we're inside the actual chat element, we can just render these out. So you notice that this component's template is made up of other components. So immediately, I think if you've ever done, I mean, we all used to be terrible at coding at one point in time, and you end up creating a bit of a mess. And this might have been one huge file with all these different bindings and loops and stuff to sort of construct the list of users. So this way, we can essentially have our data in one container and pass it down to other components. So these are our 3 dummy components that we're going to use. And inside of here, we've got the ng onInit, which again is our lifecycle hook. When the component's ready, we can go and make like an AJAX request and go and fetch that data that we need for the component. So let's assume that this isn't hard-coded, and this is actually part of our application. We've got 3 different properties. We've got the chat user, which is me, and I am currently online. We have a chat term, so we have an input. It's going to be an empty string. So when I start typing, I could type in somebody's name and try and find them as a friend. And then we've also got the chat friends as a response from the array. So we could have a list of all my contacts, and I can click on one of them, and I can start typing. So now we've got this one component with all the data inside. We can break up those pieces of data into smaller components that manage themselves. So this is the idea behind this. So we'll start with the chat user. It's just an object, has my name, has a Boolean as the value of online. And Angular 2, I didn't like this at first, and I thought, why are we using square brackets? It just looks weird. Does anyone think that looks weird? Nobody, everyone loves it. One person. So the square brackets basically means that you're providing an input. And I personally think it's more explicit than the way that Angular 1 does things and the way that React does things. Purely because the type of binding, the type of prop is very explicit. So the square brackets means it's an input. I'm passing some data down. And we'll come on to the other type of binding, which will finish off my sentence. So we've basically said that I want to pass the chat user down. That is just the value here. That's as simple as that. And then we have the chat term. That's just an empty string. We can just pass that down anyway. And again, we're going to create a custom property called term. So we'll just bind that and pass it down. And then we've also got the array response, which we're then also going to pass down into the chat list. So again, we've got our high-level container, all the data, and we're starting to sort of pass this data down into our components. So once something has actually changed, so for instance, if I have my list of friends and I want to click on one of them, what do we do then? So again, in this high-level container component where we've got our data, we also have a couple of callbacks. So I've got an onStatus change. So if my profile is online and I say, okay, I'm going offline now, we can then have this function gets called. Similarly, if I start typing, I can then pass the value that I'm typing back up to the parent component. And when I select a contact that I want to talk to, I can also get that piece of information. And you can see here that everything is being done in one place. So this makes it a stateful component. So here, let's say, for example, I typed in Ryan, who's in the audience, and he had a random unique hash key generated for his particular user. I could pass that user back up from the child to this component, and inside of here, I could make a request and like set up a WebSocket or something like this that initiates our conversation in that little box. Oop, there we go. So if I have the status change, I want to pass this down. If you're doing React or Angular 1 components, this will look very familiar. So back to the brackets thing. We've got square brackets for data and round brackets, normal brackets for like an event. So if you're using a custom event like this, so I'm creating a custom property called status change, which we'll hook up in a minute. But you could also put something like click in here. So if I wanted a click event, you just put the word click. Whereas if I put click inside the square brackets, that would not work. And once you've learned the difference between the two, the square brackets and the normal syntax, that makes a lot more sense. So again, we obviously have this function, the onStatus change. The event comes back through the function arguments. So what we do is basically pass it down, and then Angular looks for this $event. So this will then give us whatever we pass down, what we pass up from the child to the parent. Similarly, we have the onSearch change, which has an event. We can pass this one down with a property called search change. And we also have onContactSelect, which does the exact same thing. And you can see through all of those that they look pretty simple. It's just data, what happens when the data changes, data, what happens when the data changes. And you can obviously create more and more of these if you needed to. So now we've talked about like a high-level container. We've got the chat element, the chat component, and we've created 3 components that we've started to pass data down and listen for some kind of event back. This is what we typically call like a stateless component or a dumb component. So inside of here, we're not going to do any AJAX requests. If you think about a pure JavaScript function where you might have an argument of A, comma, B, and you could just do return A plus B. That function does not communicate outside of its scope. So this is what these kind of are. They're components that do not communicate outside the scope. But the input, like the arguments of a function, is the data that's coming into the component. And when you return something, you return a new collection. So if you think about that as the event that's coming out of the component. So I don't really like this, but it works. This is TypeScript. This is where we use some more decorators. I think they are coming in ES6. So whether we like decorators or not is not our choice. So we have this at input, which basically defines, it tells Angular that there is an input coming into this component called user. So if that doesn't make sense, it's this one here. So we're inside the chat profile here. We flick back, and we're expecting an input of data called user. So Angular will then attach itself to this value. Now we can do the exact same thing with an event. So when we expect an event callback, we have something called status change. So here we create a new instance of what we call the event emitter, which creates a new event object bound to the property. Now, inside of here, we're using the onInit lifecycle hook again. And where we had that piece of data that says name Todd motto online true. So if I'm online, like here, this piece of text will then say online. Otherwise, it will say offline. So this is actually in here as the user status. So this will then just toggle as the actual data updates. Now, the way that it updates is this thing. So we have this toggle status function. Now, this is local to the component, and all it does is just fire an event. So where we did status change equals the event emitter at the top, what this actually does is just bind an instance, so we can then call this .emit. So we're just going to pass a value. This is technically calling the parent's function from the child. So we pass it down, it's just going to call it, it's going to emit the event back up. So we can pass this up, we can pass this piece of information, and all this component does, for example, is just toggle the status. Am I online? Am I offline? So we can just invert the expression here because it's going to be true or false. So we can just pass that piece back up. Now, the interesting thing with one-way data flow is that you might think, how do we update this piece of text in the actual HTML? So we have this user status here. Like inside the toggle status function, do we do this .user status and then call that expression again? So what we can do instead, because of one-way data flow and how Angular will actually listen to the change detection, when this toggle status gets called, it basically goes up to the parent component, and where we were expecting this event back, like here, for example, what we could do is then rebind to this component in this data, and that change, where we actually do something with this event object that's been passed back up, we could mutate it, for example, that change will actually then go and call this ng on changes. So we've mutated some state, some local component state. We've pressed a button, for example, to toggle the status. It's gone up to the parent. The parent has then said, okay, something's changed. I need to update all of my components. And the ones that are listening for the updates get this on changes. So I think in React, it's component will receive props, or should component update, one of the two. So this is basically it. And we get this changes object down. We can check if the user property exists, which is the input that we were just listening to. And we have the changes.currentValue. So what we can basically do is just clone this. So where we have this.user, we can then use object assign. We can then basically merge. We can, instead of mutating the existing object, we can create a new one and rebind it. So it keeps things slightly immutable. So this piece was just components today. Now, I think if you're going to learn either Angular, Angular 1, Angular 2, any kind of framework that talks about components, is try and focus on the raw framework before we start adding things like these. Because once you understand the inputs and the outputs and the event callbacks and these kind of things, you can then start scaling your applications with something like Redux. Like if you're building like a to-do app, you do not need Redux, for example. Yeah, it's like good to start learning with, but there's a lot of noise that we can't do anything without Redux anymore. So understanding how to build just pure component architecture, that was the goal of today. These are some of the other things that I'd like to cover at some point. Angular has an ahead of time compilation, which was released very recently. If anyone's been following the Angular 2 progress, they basically break a lot of things, and now they've released a stable version. So this ahead of time compilation, because we're using HTML templates, it allows Angular core to use static code analysis. So what this will basically do, it can analyze the code without running the code. So something like JSX, it needs to be ran. What we can do is basically turn all that HTML templates into pure JavaScript before it doesn't need compiling. So Angular will never actually ship the HTML, if that makes sense. We can also bootstrap in a web worker. So a web worker is a separate processing core. So my slides are actually being run in the browser at the moment. And in the browser, I've got like all the data for the slides. I've got the UI. I've got the colors for the CSS. Now, if you bootstrap Angular in a web worker, what it will actually do is take all the data processing. Imagine you've got like 10,000 lines of JavaScript that you're trying to parse at once. So you can put Angular 2 in the web worker, parse all the information in this separate processing core, and Angular will basically patch between the web worker and the DOM, so your DOM is just lightning quick, like super, super fast. So there's some of the cool stuff. And server-side. I hope that was a lot to get through in 22 minutes. But yeah, thank you for listening.